The human brain is built to favor efficiency over change. Most of what we do on a daily basis, how we react to stress, how we speak to ourselves, and how we procrastinate or avoid discomfort, runs on subconscious loops. These loops are housed in a structure called the basal ganglia, which stores routines that over time become automatic. This is useful when those routines serve us. But when they don't, when they trap us in patterns of self-sabotage or low energy, the very mechanism meant to save effort becomes the reason we stay stuck. To reset your life, you must engage something known as top-down override. Top-down override is a process initiated by the prefrontal cortex, the seat of conscious control and executive function. It's the part of the brain responsible for impulse suppression, decision-making, and goal setting. And when you decide to change, genuinely decide, it's this region that begins firing signals that contradict what your older, habit-driven brain wants to do. That's not a comfortable process. In fact, it often feels like internal friction. You may feel resistance, fatigue, and when even confusion, but that's the brain doing exactly what it's supposed to, protecting energy and stability. And when your job is to override that resistance using deliberate, intentional effort, this override is not conceptual, it's biological. And when the act of resisting a habit, like reaching for your phone out of boredom or reacting with anger in a familiar situation, requires a surge of neural energy. Functional MRI studies show increased activity in the prefrontal cortex during moments of deliberate behavioral change. The harder the override, the greater the activation. Consistently. That's proof that change at the level of identity doesn't start with belief. It starts with mechanical disruption of habit loops. You do consistently. You don't override once and get a reset. You override daily, repeatedly in small moments. You choose not to hit snooze. You choose to journal instead of scroll. You choose the workout even when your brain offers 10 reasons not to. Each of these moments strengthens the top-down circuitry. With repetition, the brain begins to rewire, favoring the new pattern. In effect, and the override becomes the new default. The habit loop is replaced, not through insight or emotional clarity, but through brute consistency. When you do consistently, and here's the crucial point, override doesn't feel like transformation. It often feels dull, mechanical, or even pointless in the moment. But under the surface, synaptic connections are weakening and strengthening in real time. Neurons are pruning the old path and reinforcing the new one. Over days and weeks, this neural restructuring leads to behavioral changes that seem effortless, but they are not. They are the result of repeated top-down override and forcing a system reset that biology would never initiate on its own. So if you're waiting for motivation to shift your life, and you're waiting on a system that was never designed to lead. The leader is you, armed with effort and directing the brain to change whether it wants to or not. That's the neurobiology of a true reset. And when you do consistently, the fastest way to create in your life isn't through motivation or mindset. It's through the body, specifically by using physiological self-intervention to force the brain to pay attention. And when we introduce extreme but controlled stimuli, like waking up significantly earlier than usual, immersing in cold water, and when you do consistently, or delaying food intake through fasting, we create biological signals strong enough to disrupt our brain's default patterns. These signals don't just wake us up in the metaphorical sense. They recalibrate our nervous system at the cellular level. Your brain is constantly scanning for cues about safety, urgency, and change. Most of the time, when we live in predictable patterns and the brain down regulates its attentional systems, it assumes there's no need to invest resources in adapting. And when you do consistently, that's why change feels impossible when you're stuck. The brain doesn't see a reason to change. But when you introduce physiological stressors, like a cold shower that shocks the nervous system or a fast that alters metabolic rhythms, you activate brain regions involved in survival, and particularly the brainstem and hypothalamus. These areas then send out a cascade of signal sows, increased norepinephrine, and elevated cortisol within healthy bounds, activation of the sympathetic nervous system. These chemical messengers do something important. They increase alertness, heighten focus, and make the brain more plastic, more changeable. And you're no longer running the same program. The brain is now on high alert, reevaluating its environment and we're mapping its understanding of what's important. That's the window where change becomes possible. Take waking up early, for example. And when you disrupt your circadian rhythm deliberately, waking up at 5 a.m. instead of your usual 8, you're not just adjusting your schedule, and you're altering melatonin and cortisol secretion patterns. Morning light hits the retina earlier, sends signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and begins to shift your entire biological clock. This reset in timing affects mood, focus, metabolic function, and sleep architecture. In other words, you're forcing a system-wide recalibration by changing one physical behavior. And cold exposure works similarly, but through a different route. When cold hits your skin, thermoreceptors send immediate distress signals. This triggers a rise in dopamine and norepinephrine, making you feel more awake, more motivated, and more focused. But more importantly, it trains the brain to tolerate discomfort. That kind of neural resilience transfers. Over time, your brain becomes more capable of handling emotional discomfort, uncertainty, or resistance because you've rehearsed that physiological stress state in a controlled way. Fasting operates on yet another system, your energy metabolism. By withholding calories for a deliberate period, and you challenge your insulin glucose response, elevate ketones, and activate autophagy. But in the brain, you're also boosting levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor (MBDNF), a compound associated with neuroplasticity and cognitive performance. And the result is not just fat loss or metabolic health, it's improved mental clarity and decision-making, and which are essential when you're trying to reset your life. So the key insight is this: the body leads, the brain follows. You can't think your way into a new life if your physiology still belongs to the old one. Use movement, discomfort, and when you do deprivation, not as punishment, but as a stimulus. These interventions speak the language the brain understands: biology, and in biology is where the reset begins. When people talk about changing their lives, they often focus on motivation, waiting for the perfect moment, the right mood, or a sudden burst of clarity. But the truth is, motivation is biologically unreliable. It comes and goes, and when you do consistently, tied to neurotransmitter spikes that are fleeting and unstable. What your brain actually responds to, what truly reshapes its circuitry, is consistency. This is the foundation of neuroplasticity, and the process by which your brain physically rewires itself through repeated behaviors, not passing intentions. And neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. But here's the critical nuance. Experience doesn't mean thoughts or feelings. It means action repeated over time. And when you consistently, when you perform a new behavior, even something as simple as walking a different route, speaking differently to yourself, or going to sleep at a consistent hour, you activate a specific neural pathway. If you do it once, the brain registers it as noise. But if you do it over and over, day after day, that pathway gets stronger. The brain begins to favor it. That's the moment when it becomes a default rather than a decision. Think of it this way: everything you do consistently, every behavior is a vote for the kind of person your brain believes you are. The more votes a behavior gets through repetition, the more resources the brain allocates to making that behavior easier. Synaptic connections strengthen. Myelin sheaths thicken along the most used neural highways. This is how habits are formed, but more importantly, it's how identity is reshaped from the inside out. What this means practically is that you can't wait to feel like changing, and you can't depend on your emotional state to guide your actions. You have to flip that equation. Act first and allow the brain to catch up. And when you show up to the gym repeatedly, regardless of mood, your brain learns this is what we do now. When you speak affirmations aloud each morning, even if you don't believe them yet, your auditory cortex, motor cortex, and prefrontal systems begin integrating that language into your self-model. And belief follows behavior, not the other way around. The same applies to eliminating negative behaviors. If you're trying to reset from chronic distraction, poor sleep, or negative self-talk, you don't just break habits. You replace them. When you do consistently, you give the brain something to wire into its circuitry, not just something to avoid. This requires structure, not willpower. Consistently, it means scheduling the new pattern, tracking it, and enforcing it like a biological training protocol. because that's what it is. And you're not trying to conspire. The brain, you're training it like a muscle. It responds to load, reps, and frequency. The consistency of behavior is the only thing that convinces your nervous system that change is not a momentary experiment, but when a permanent shift in reality. So when it comes to resetting your life, don't worry about motivation. Focus on reps. Wake up, execute, repeat. That's the language your brain understands, and that's how rewiring begins. And one of the most persistent illusions the brain creates is the idea that you need to feel ready before taking action. This illusion is reinforced by a feedback loop between the limbic system, the brain's emotional center, and the prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making. The problem is the limbic system is inherently conservative. It favors familiarity and resists perceived threats, even if those threats are positive, like a major life change. So when you're standing on the edge of a decision, starting a new habit, and ending a toxic pattern, waking up earlier, the emotional circuits in your brain send a clear signal, not yet. And this hesitation is a protective mechanism, but it's not a wise one. It's based on outdated wiring that evolved to avoid physical threats and not psychological discomfort. The brain mistakes discomfort for danger and pumps the brakes. If you obey that signal, and when you enter a paralysis loop, endlessly waiting for a moment when emotion and action finally align, that alignment rarely happens. And when it does, it's short-lived. The truth is the brain's readiness switch doesn't flip before you act. It flips after. This is where understanding neural activation becomes critical. The circuitry responsible for movement, the motor system, can override emotional hesitation. When you take an action that contradicts your emotional state, like getting out of bed despite exhaustion or going for a walk despite anxiety, and you trigger a top-down shift in brain chemistry, you activate dopamine and norepinephrine pathways that immediately begin changing your internal state. And the very act of doing something uncomfortable starts to rewire how you feel, how you think, and what you believe about yourself. The mistake most people make is assuming emotion is the green light. But in the neurobiological sequence of change, when you do consistently, emotion follows action, not the other way around. The reset happens when you act before you feel like it, and when you move your body into the cold shower while your brain screams no. And when you begin journaling while your limbic system offers you every excuse to stop. That conflict is where the real transformation begins, because you are teaching your nervous system that resistance is not a command, it's just noise. Over time, this sequence becomes the new baseline. You no longer need to consult your emotional weather report to act. When you built a system where behavior leads and feelings follow, this is how discipline forms, not from raw willpower, but from repeated neural exposure to discomfort and the confidence that you can act anyway. In brain terms, in the system, this is known as increasing cognitive control over affective states. In practical terms, it's called freedom. So when you're tempted to delay a reset until you feel ready, recognize that moment for what it is, a trap set by the very circuitry you're trying to rewire. When you do consistently, the only way to escape it is to act while unready. That's the neurological doorway to transformation. The reset doesn't wait for permission. It begins with movement. Resetting your life is not about waiting for clarity, confidence, or motivation. It's about understanding the mechanics of your own biology and taking command of it. Every habit you've built, every pattern you're stuck in, is wired into your nervous system through repetition and reinforcement. The only way out is through deliberate override, by forcing new behaviors that send strong signals to your brain that change is not only possible, it's already happening. When you wake up early before your body wants to, step into cold when your system craves warmth, or act decisively in the face of hesitation, and when you do consistently, you're not just building mental toughness, you're physically rewiring the circuits that shape your identity. You are interrupting the old loop, inserting a new rhythm and conditioning your brain to follow your lead. Don't wait to feel ready. Don't wait for the perfect plan. Begin with the next action, no matter how small, and repeat it until it becomes your new baseline. And your brain doesn't need perfection. It needs proof. Show it with behavior. Show it with consistency. That's how you reset your life. Not once, but as a daily neurological process.